In your life, can you think of situations where you've been zealous for the Lord, you've put together a lot of energy and effort, you prayed about something, and all of a sudden people start to leave? Resources aren't there. There's no money. There's no something. It's like the Lord pulls the rug out from under you. But what's going on is He's wanting to be involved as a partner. And He's going to set up your resources in such a way He gets the glory, because we've been created for that purpose, to glorify Him.
Well, we are diving in on today's podcast, acknowledging that at times it can feel like God's pulled the rug out from under you. I'm Ken Powell, and I have felt that way on several occasions in my lifetime. Haven't you? Well, Dr. Bruce Cook is going to help us navigate the difficult reality that sometimes you just cannot fathom how your limited resources could possibly accomplish the vision that God has put in front of you. Maybe it's limited skill set or finances, personnel, access to raw materials. Whatever the limiting factor is, it's often easier to just bail out than to continue to pursue a path forward. Are you there right now in an arena of your life? Well, Bruce is continuing to pull from the story of Gideon as he talks about a key strategy that includes taking the time to sit and listen to God, to listen to our competitors, to listen to our customers. You know, God told Gideon to sit and listen and told him to go down to the enemy camp, and God provided him with wisdom for the mission. Now, if you're like me, you stick to common logic and typical strategy, especially when you're working from a position of limited resources. Better safe than sorry, right? Well, Gideon had limited resources, and it wasn't God's plan for him to follow typical methodology to conquer the Midianites. God had a unique plan to leverage limited resources to accomplish exponential returns, exponential gains. We see that principle throughout Scripture. Well, you remember the story about the 5 loaves, the 2 fish? How about the story of the fishermen who had been fishing all night? They were exhausted. They were done for the day. Jesus comes along, tells them to go back out on the lake at what most would consider probably the worst time of day to fish. And they brought in the largest haul of their lives. And then how about that shepherd boy, David, and his sling? Limited resources, great faith. Here's Dr. Bruce Cook.
Let's go to Judges chapter 7. We're going to pick up Gideon again in our faith planning process. Just for review, there's 7 elements, the first of which was a mission statement that frames what you're going to be doing and answers the question, why? Why are we here? Then secondly, the partnership idea, that whatever we're getting into in life is a partnership actively with the Lord. He's interested in what we do. He wants to be a part of us. And our part is faith, and His part is to provide and direct and reward, among other things. And then we need a vision and conviction, and that was the fleece. That's the idea of making sure this is from the Lord, because when we are tested later, and we will be, we need to know this is from Him. And then we need to translate the vision into a specific goal, an actual step that we can take. And in our last session, that's where we left Gideon. He's camped his troops of 32,000. His goal is to attack the Midianite army in this one encounter and to try to defeat them. So let's see what happens then. In verse 2, the Lord said to Gideon of chapter 7, "You have too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands." Now let me ask you, how many Midianite soldiers are there? It's 135,000. How many does Gideon have? 32,000. Is that too many? Doesn't sound like it. But look what the Lord says. You have too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands, in order that Israel may not boast against me that her own strength had saved her. Can you see the Lord's concern? In fact, let's come back to our mission and purpose statement. What's our purpose statement? To glorify God. If we do things in such a way that God is taken out of it, who does that glorify? And that's what happened here. So you recall the story. The Lord said, you've got to cut back. So Gideon cuts down 22,000. And then 22,000 men leave. That's 10,000 remaining, small number. But then the Lord said in verse 4, there are still too many men. And you recall the story. He goes down to 300. Now let me ask you something. That's kind of scary. You got 135,000 enemy troops, you have 300 men, and all you have is a partnership with God. But that's all you need. In your life, can you think of situations where you've been zealous for the Lord? You've put together a lot of energy and effort. You prayed about something. You're counting on your 32,000 soldiers to do the job for you, and all of a sudden people start to leave. Resources aren't there. There's no money. There's no something. And you got to imagine how Gideon felt. It's like the Lord pulls the plug out from under you, the rug out from under you. But what's going on is He's wanting to be involved as a partner. And He's going to set up your resources in such a way that who gets the glory? He gets the glory because we've been created for that purpose, to glorify Him. Now let's come back to Gideon. He still has to figure out how to use his limited resources to accomplish his goal. And that's going to be the next element in faith planning. That's called faith strategy. It answers the question, how? How do you take your limited resources and actually accomplish a goal that's much bigger than whatever you could imagine you would accomplish? Well, let's see what happens. The Lord comes back, and beginning in verse 9, it says, "The camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night the Lord said to Gideon, 'Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack,'" and you knew he was. Anybody in their right mind would be afraid with 300 men to attack. He says, "If you're afraid to attack, go down to this camp with your servant and listen to what they're saying." You might just circle that word "listen" in your Bible. Remember, we said at the beginning, one of the challenges in faith planning is motion, is activism. It's hard to sit still, and yet there's admonition here to listen again. It says, "Afterwards you will be encouraged to attack the camp." Isn't that interesting? So Gideon doesn't have a better idea. Takes his servant, he goes down, and he sits outside the tent of the Midianite soldiers. And he listens to them talking. And while they're talking, they describe their own fear of Gideon. And then Gideon sees the picture. Guess who had put fear in their hearts? God had. And suddenly he realizes how he's going to do the job. His strategy becomes one of taking his limited resources, encircling the camp at night, giving them a bugle, a trumpet, and a torch. And if they're already fearful, creating such havoc that they turn on themselves. You see the idea? That's how you can take limited resources, but it's based upon God preceding you. God is actively involved. He's already there waiting for you to show up. Now let me ask you, if you had not taken that alternative, and you had 300 men, and you go down to your local bookstore, and you buy a book on how to lead war, or warfare, how to lead an army, and you pick a Napoleonic approach. So at high noon, you take your 300 men, and you line them up, and you go straight into the enemy. Now, this is God's mission. He's called you to do it, but what do you think would happen? Be wiped out. And a lot of times as Christians, we do exactly that kind of thing. We take our limited resources, and rather than seeing how God has preceded us and coming up with a faith strategy that builds upon that, we just take those folks, line them up at high noon, and march straight into the enemy, and we get wiped out. So faith strategy is the process of discerning how God has preceded you and taking advantage of that. And that requires sitting outside the tent. In other words, taking the time to discern what's going on. A number of years ago, I was doing some consulting work for a company, and this owner had a missionary coming back from the Asian mission field and wanted to have him share over lunch what was taking place there. So we sat down in this room, and he got up and started to talk about his adventure in going to a cannibalistic island to present the gospel to a tribe that had never heard the gospel before. And he talked about the difficulty of learning the language, and the more he learned the language, he even became more concerned because he began to realize that this tribe had an inverted value system. As he told the story of Judas betraying Jesus, the tribe members actually applauded Judas because in their tribe, the highest value was treachery, and they were cannibalistic. He became even more concerned because obviously his life was on the line, and they were becoming very friendly with him. So he's trying to figure out how you share the gospel in the context of an inverted value system where there's nothing there that he can build off of in terms of sharing what he thought was the gospel in a way they could hear. One day he's doing his work and some tribal leaders come along and he asks where they're going, and they said, well, we're going to the tribe down to the next area and we're going to establish a peace treaty with them. And he thought, well, now how do you establish a peace treaty if you're treacherous? And in his reply to that question, they told him that what we do to preserve peace is we take the son of our chief and we exchange him with the son of the chief of the other tribe. And then in that exchange, we make sure that there's no treachery and we maintain peace. And then a light went on. And he said, let me tell you about the chief in heaven that sent his son to this earth so we could have peace through him. And in this process, the whole tribe began to understand the nature of the gospel, and they converted to Christianity. And he later wrote a book called Peace Child, and Billy Graham took a film crew and filmed this whole experience. And his thesis was, in every culture, in every age, there is a gospel equivalent, a way to share the gospel that culturally communicates. And he said one of the greatest challenges for those of us in the ministry and as missionaries is to learn what that is before we actually go and present. And that's the idea of sitting outside the tent, of understanding what God has placed into that culture, into that environment that you can build off of. How has God preceded you? Now let's apply that in our business arena, because we need a strategy to accomplish our faith goals. In the business world, the equivalent of sitting outside the tent is getting close to your customer. If you think about it, no business or organization can exist unless you're meeting the needs of your customer. Even if you're a ministry, you still have a customer. If you're a church, you still have a customer. And so it's getting close to your customer and understanding what their needs are, and then figuring out how you're going to respond to their needs. Let me illustrate this by again referring to our business, Choosing the Best Publishing. We determined that our customer was the large school district. And so I picked up the phone one day, and as we were starting out, I decided to call one of the largest school districts in Georgia and basically go down and sit outside the tent and listen to them and figure out what their needs were. And they said, well, it's interesting because we're having a meeting of a sex education review committee that's in charge of the policies for our whole district. And if you'd like, you can come in and make a presentation. I said, but before we make a presentation, let me come and do some interview with you. And as we started to interview the school district, we began to see the following. Number one, a lot of parents were concerned about what was happening in the school with their children. A lot of parents were concerned that their children were not getting the type of emphasis on abstinence education. A lot of the teachers were frustrated because they didn't know how to present and teach the material. And the students were not getting any kind of motivational message to change their behavior. So in sitting outside the tent, we came up with a strategy about how to present our material. So I went into that particular meeting, and the reporter from our local paper decided that they wanted to attend the meeting also, just to see how school districts evaluate this controversial issue of sex education. And so when I went in and made the presentation, there were about 30 people in the room, 20 of whom were parents. And as I started going through the presentation, I really focused on the parents. And as they saw our material, the issue became helping the parents see how this would help solve their need for their child to get the same kind of message at school that they would like to provide at home, which was to be abstinent until marriage. It's the only way to eliminate the risk, and you do it in such a way that the kids feel like it's a reward so they can accomplish future goals and objectives. And as we laid this out, they listened, and then at the end, they asked the parents to comment on what I had said, and the parents did an amazing thing. They started standing up and basically saying, throw the textbooks out, get this material in, and get it in now, and if you don't have money, we'll pay for it. What had happened? We had figured out that in terms of our strategy, we need to get champions involved in each school district who had a passion for abstinence, and they became the leverage through whom things started to change. We found also with teachers, it was the same way. We always had to have one champion in each district through whom we could work. And if we had one champion, then we could start to be successful. And now, as a result, over the last 5 years, we're in over half the school districts in Georgia, and more than half of the middle and high school students in the state are going through our curriculum. But it was because we stopped long enough to figure out what the strategy was and what the felt need was. Now I'm going to ask you in your workshops to work through a strategy, and we're going to call this determining the critical events of your strategy, and you're going to ask 3 questions, each of which start with a W. Who, what, and why? Who is the key person that will make the determination of your success in terms of accomplishing your goal? What we found in the school districts is we had to get not only the champion, but we had to get to the decision maker. In any large organization, you can spend a lot of time with different people, but if they're not the decision maker, no matter what you do, you haven't accomplished what you need to. So we had to always start with the decision maker. Typically, that would be the curriculum director. In your business, in your organization or ministry, there's a key individual that's the critical part to your faith goal becoming a reality. And so you got to answer the question, who is that person? Secondly, what does that person have to do? What we determined is they have to become a champion. We cannot push a curriculum through a school district unless we have a champion. As you think about your strategy, what is it you're going to ask that person to do? Are they going to have to make a decision? Are they going to have to make a presentation? Are they going to have to purchase? Whatever it is, put that down. And then the last part is, why should they do it? Now, this comes back to their felt need. Many times in business, I think we get trapped in presenting our product in such a way, or our service in such a way, that it's meeting our need and not the customer's need. So the whole challenge is to turn around your product or service so you're meeting their need and you're showing them how their need is met. So now when we go in to present to a school district, we'll always start with the issue of what's the problem. Because if they don't agree there's a problem, then we usually don't do well there. And we have some research that shows that by the 12th grade, 60% of all 12th graders would have been sexually active. In other words, have had sexual intercourse at least one time. And when I put that on the table, I asked this question, does this sound like your school district? And in the hundreds that I've presented to, I've never yet had one that say, that's not us. But when they see the dramatic percentage, and they realize that these kids start in middle school and start almost doubling every year, then we start to build in the motivation to help them solve whose problem? Their problem with our product or service, versus coming in and telling them how good our product or service is. So in your strategy in business, you want to ask and answer, who is the person that I need to get on my side? What is it I need to have them do? And then why would they do it? And if you can't come up with a good answer on why, chances are maybe you haven't really figured out that felt need yet. And that's where you need to spend a lot of time. When I was talking about my healthcare organization earlier, when we would go in and contract with hospitals, we were bringing new patients to the hospital, we had to negotiate a flat fee contract, which meant it was inflexible in terms of volume because of Medicare laws. The challenge was to come up with a contract that would address the financial need of the hospital and our need. And what happened is that in our business, as the reimbursement went down and as other things, length of stay went down, the contracts no longer made sense for the hospitals. so they no longer had a felt need. And as a result, we no longer had a business. So in your business or organization, the challenge is to be able to take the time and really understand the felt need of those that you're trying to work with in terms of accomplishing your faith goals. The last part of the faith strategy is to take faith steps. Gideon had his strategy, but he still had to go back and tell his troops, now here's what we're going to do. I want you to surround the enemy at night. Everybody nods their head. I'm going to give you a pitcher, a trumpet, and a torch. And at the right time, we're going to blow the trumpet, we're going to crack the pitcher, and then you're going to light your torch. Now let me ask you, these 300 guys are surrounding a group of 135,000. What if the strategy doesn't work? Well, they become target practice. They're standing up there with their torch. What does that mean? That means quite often in our faith strategy, there's an element of risk from a human standpoint. If you have limited resources and God's asking you to step out and accomplish something great, from a human standpoint, there's a sense of risk and anxiety. But from a divine standpoint, that's where our partner comes in. And because we've sat outside the tent, we understand how He's preceded us. And therefore, we have the confidence to take our faith steps. And it's only when we start to take the faith step that we're then exercising biblical faith.
Well, those are great reminders from Bruce as he talked about the fact that there is a way to present the gospel that works in each unique cultural setting. So what is your strategy? Are you getting close to your customer to understand their needs? Who is that key person, that decision maker? What does that person have to do to make your faith goal a reality? And why would they get involved and become a champion for you? Well, and that really speaks to loving our customer well, so that we're pursuing true value for them and never lowering ourselves into manipulation or exploitation for our own gains alone. And that final admonition that Bruce shared, that we must take faith steps once we have that business strategy. And yes, there is still risk. Great faith requires an ongoing tension with great risk. It is always better to journey with other Christian business leaders as you prayerfully consider business strategy and lean into wise counsel while considering those risks. FCCI's business leadership groups are a wonderful opportunity to do just that on a regular basis. You can learn more at fcci.org. Well, thanks for listening, and may God increase your faith as you walk confidently forward for His glory, taking the right risks as He guides your steps.